see Bonnie Raitt in '73 at the Bottom Line in New York. It's like, who walks out with her? My hero, Steve Stills. Fucking hell. And I have to spend an hour and a half watching Steve Stills dribble out of his nose and dribble up and down the guitar fretboard. And everything, every hope and dream of the 60s was dashed on stupidity and going nowhere. And to have had that, and suddenly, I think Lizzie's idea is that the hippies wanted their revenge for having their dreams shattered. I mean, McLaren was a hippie in that sense. So I look at it a bit like that, but just waiting for something to happen that was as exciting as the 60s, and suddenly that was it that day. On stage, there he was, Mr. Lydon, and this incredible barrage of sound. Although I have awful news for anybody here who is a Pistols fan. I actually interviewed Steve Jones 2 months ago in Los Angeles. Mr. Jones is the hottest thing in American radio at the moment, doing a very desultory talk show, which is the hippest thing in America. And he's fantastic at it, but in doing this, I mentioned what bands did he like, and he said that he does a thing called Whistling for Winners on his show, and he whistled The Young Ones by Cliff Richard because he wants to have Cliff Richard on his show. But he confessed that his favourite song, at the time I was watching him thinking the world is changing, his favourite band was Boston. And I'm going, Steve, you can't not... Yeah, Boston, man, more than a... Sorry, he loved more than a... can you believe that?
Well, I can actually, in a funny sort of way.
Because dreadful.
What was interesting about this, I mean, the Sex Pistols, as soon as they played at Leicester Free Trade Hall, definitely fitted into that idea. You thought, you know, if you were into Faust and Neil Young and just music, just taking it on that level, not the fashion and the people they came up with dressed in the strange costumes that scared the willies out of us Northerners a little bit because we were dressed in our granddad's suits. So all of that was interesting, but that hadn't happened yet. But just on a musical basis, just pure music, the dynamics and the strangeness of it was what was so exhilarating.
So
and Johnny Lydon, I think, brought a lot into that. And when he did that amazing radio show very early on and played all his favourites that completely upset Malcolm because he was so obviously into music, and he played Peter Hamill and he played Catchy Beefheart and he played Can. And it was those things that were inside the Sex Pistols that were initially the greatest feeling for me. The fact that it was also associated with fantastic design and great slogans and fabulous mischief and radical intent was just an extraordinary bonus that accelerated everything very quickly.
And that's the funny thing. I mean, I have this supposedly fallacious and boring 13-year cycle theory. You've heard this, haven't you? I know it's a pile of bollocks. But the fact that British youth culture explodes every 13 years, 1963, 1976, 1989, those are true explosions. If you go back 13 years from 63, you get 1950, which is Teddy Boy. So it's a really kind of good argument. And also, Buddhists will tell you that in Western Europe there is a 13-year cycle in the interest in Buddhism throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But what's weird is that I thought something would happen in 2002. Obviously it didn't do, so I was completely wrong. But what did happen is I expected some British bands to absorb the best that was coming out of America, in the way that the Pistols absorbed Iggy. Iggy's so important in all this. And in fact it did happen, and it happened with 2 or 3 young metal bands from the Rhondda Valley. And I think the music that Funeral for a Friend and Lost Prophets play is just stunning. And I went to see the Funeral for a Friend about 2 weeks ago, and I suddenly realised why it didn't happen. The music's fantastic. They absorbed new metal, American new metal. They regurgitated it with English wit, which is what the idea is. But there was no drug, there was no attitude, there was no politics, there was no clothes. It needs all those things, doesn't it?
It does. It has me trembling on something. I did a little panel a few weeks ago for Simon Reynolds in his book, Rip It Up, the post-punk book, Rip It Up and Start Again, where he talks about that, all that music that kind of happened just after, from 78 onwards, the Gang of Four, Wire, Joy Division, Public Image. And it's a terrible thing because we're already suffering from it slightly here, which is that great phrase, I remember when, and what it was like then, and this kind of terrible sort of concern that you have when you've been around for as long as we have, that you're just saying it was great in the old days and it's rubbish now. And even though that might be the case, there has to be a tremendous amount of explanation and discussion and debate about why that is the case. And I think what you've just hinted at, for me, is one of the interesting things that's happened, is that after 30 years now, after those initial musical movements, it's made it through by a strange series of journeys to the mainstream. And what's left is just the sort of outer shell of it, if you like. And so everybody can look like it now, and they can, bands now can have members that look like they come from, 68, one member from 68, one member from 77, one from 83, all from your 13 years. It can be a band like that. So they all look the part, and they know how to make the sounds now, and the sounds can be recreated so wonderfully by all the time machines, But what's missing actually is a sense of the absolute risk that you take intellectually, psychologically, to actually make, statements that might actually destroy your commercial potential. It seems very much now that it's very much using all of that to be a commercial success. And obviously now bands that once upon a time would have taken 3-4 albums to sell 10,000 copies, now, first album, 2 million copies. They're completely sort of promoted out of their depth. They don't have an apprenticeship period, if you like, to become something that's genuinely iconic and has genuine meaning. This, of course, is just another way of saying, I remember when. But I think it's kind of an interesting point, because for the first time in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a series of bands that do sound like those great bands from the late 70s and early 80s that were rejecting rock cliches, what at the time was called rockism, And now finally that's made it to the mainstream. And it's something about it that I sometimes puzzle with myself, why it's unsatisfying. Because it seems to have finally done it. Bands that sound like Gang of Four and Public Image and Joy Division, you hear them in America all the time. They're in the top 5. They're on the television all the time. They're in all the magazines. But something's missing. And I think what's missing is a sense that they're not just referring to the sound of those bands, but they're referring to what those bands were influenced by outside music. Cinema, literature, all sorts of things that weren't just about the music, but that fed in and actually wanting to change things through music that went beyond music. Now they just want to have a hit, which is fine and nice, and it makes pop music interesting, but it hasn't got the same revolutionary vigor.
It doesn't have the same sense of itself at all. It's also because they didn't find it. It's been done before, and somehow that's kind of tedious, the Kasabians of this world. But
well, when I was doing the Simon Reynolds panel, there was an interesting thing that he started off by talking about what he called pretension. And I panicked slightly and meandered into a bit of a Gilbert O'Sullivan anecdote that I regret now. So I've been kind of pondering what I should have said at the time, because there was an interesting point he made, I think, because thinking about all the bands that came up from 76 onwards, even the Pistols to an extent, because of all the paraphernalia about it, all the ambition and adventure we had from it, there was something that the mainstream world does call pretentious, certainly the British mainstream world, the anti-intellectual zone, because of what we were trying to incorporate into it, the look of it, the design of it. I mean, you were the queen of pretension. There's no doubt about it. But it's a fascinating...
Until your Frankie double album.
Well, there you go.
Yes, which I know you try to pretentious.
Because it wasn't so much that, but it was trying to involve ideas in a world where you could do that. And it seems to be exciting to have a go, because 90% of everything is the same. It seems really important to do something that's different. And I think that punk taught us that, we could appropriate, the ideas of the 20th century. There was all the situationism thing, the surrealism thing, the Dada thing, throwing that in, mixing that in with music to create that original formula. So you say that a lot of the bands now, it's not new. A lot of what happened then wasn't necessarily new, but it was being put into a new context, and it was being mixed up in a way that it had never been mixed up before.
I don't think the bands can be attacked in that sense. People ask me a lot these days about why Franz Ferdinand sound like Joy Division or whatever else, and blah, blah, blah. And in a way, every time something wonderful happens in music, you will have had the experience of taking hold again of the sheer excitement of rock and roll, the simple, hard excitement which was punk, and then what post-punk was, what Joy Division began, and the rest, to try to say something more complex. And that moment is going to reoccur throughout musical history. So therefore, you're going to get sounds and feelings like the sound of, like Franz Ferdinand echoing Joy Division. In my opinion.
Well, I think Franz Ferdinand relate to Joy Division in the way that, say, the Manic Street Preachers were a little bit... It's a bit like the way Shwaddy Waddy were Bill Haley. And then there was a clash, and then there was Manic Street Preachers. Yes. There was Bill Haley and Shwaddy Waddy, there's Joy Division, and then there's Franz Ferdinand. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The idea you have a pop band in the charts, that were influenced by Joy Division is quite kind of exciting. But what's sort of poignant for people of our tender years is the loss of something that they give you an echo of possibility that something could have happened and it didn't quite. And so it's been made pretty, it's been made nice.
We've talked about the New York aspect, and it was very, very important. And funnily enough, that very first moment, and when you were listening to neo-jazz,